hello and welcome here. And we're here at Holistic Investments, and I'm your host, Constantin Kogan. And I'm delighted to introduce my today's guest, Apolo Ohno, who's a partner in Tribe Capital, who's an 8-time Olympic medalist and the most decorated U.S. Olympian so far. And he's an author of a book. He's an entrepreneur. He's just a thought leader, a motivator. So I don't know how many other lists, it can go on and on. But without further ado, really pleasure talking to you today, Apolo. I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot, and welcome.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's great to connect. I know that we've been trying to put this on the books for a long time, but it's always fun to chat all things investments, crypto, venture, mindset, sports, whatever rabbit hole we go down. Happy to explore.
100%. Yeah. So traditionally, we just have to throw legal disclaimers that this content is for informational purposes only. So you should not construe any such information as any material as legal, tax, investments, financial, or any other advice. So now we can talk about anything, right? So besides your exciting career of a professional athlete, right, which includes a lot of discipline, endurance, a lot of motivation that you have to motivate yourself. Well, if you can talk a little bit about how this path actually brought you to crypto.
Well, the path didn't really bring me to crypto. I think it was by happenstance. One of my roommates was involved in crypto at a really early time frame, and I had moved to the West Coast in 2010, and he was my roommate. He went on to be involved and built kind of many interesting companies. And that was my first foray into the crypto markets, was watching these guys build, I guess, the first iterations of what we all use in stable coins. And representations of that has been kind of pretty prolific in many different ways. And so my participation was very limited early on. I didn't understand it. It was challenging to grasp. People that I trusted from the financial sector told me, why should I waste my time or really go down this rabbit hole when there was many other means of trying to create revenue or a career for myself? And so I think, like many people, I probably listened to them, didn't have the conviction or the education around why this was such an important piece of technology, specifically talking about Bitcoin. But then I just kept getting pulled back. And so many friends had left their current positions in finance or venture to just spend a lot more time in this space in general. Yeah, it's been a wild ride. I think everyone who has been through a few cycles in this sector and in this vertical can definitely attest to both the resilience that these markets have, the participants themselves, and also just the sheer tenacity of some of the builders who stick with it through the kind of coldest of bear markets, so to speak. And so I've always been enamored with, I think, the neuropsychology and the human behavior aspects of why people do what they do, whether it's entrepreneurship, whether it's being a founder, whether it's trying to build something, how do you pivot, reinvent, and then all these kind of new experimental ways in which people are coming into this sector and space, whether it's those that are interested in NFTs and Web3, whether it's people who are deeply interested in infrastructure or kind of DeFi related bets or things on even a kind of more granular level on kind of a new blockchain concept and consensus mechanism. So I think the list is endless. Obviously my background is not based in tech. It was not based in cryptography of any capacity, and I wholeheartedly always admit that I am the least technical on our team at Tribe. But I'm inspired by founders and by entrepreneurs and by builders and by other venture investors who I see and look to, who really pave the way for what the next millions of people who are interested in participating either as a career or being involved in this industry in some capacity. And it never ceases to amaze me. It's not without its failures and hiccups. I think that's a part of the process. But as with all experiments, having a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis, going and actually proving that hypothesis to making it a reality is something that everyone loves to be a part of. And so there's this essence, I think, of tribalism that definitely exists, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, inside the digital assets and the entire ecosystem that is. But overall, I'm fascinated by this space. It's one of kind of several things that I do. The Tribe team itself is really unique in terms of like I think their lack of interest in marketing themselves, although they are just such a powerful group of both thought leaders, data scientists, and engineers who really think and operate like a bottoms up startup, right? So they don't operate as much like a venture shop. They really try to reinvent venture, I think, in a way that probably most who are in crypto would really be drawn to, because they've built companies, they've had success, they've scaled, they've been investors in Gusto and Slack and Facebook and all the iterations there within, even gaming and messaging apps, et cetera. And so taking that psychology mixed with this understanding and this data layer to say, how do we underwrite risk better to help engineer N of one companies and outcomes? And that was like a really unique aspect to me. So that's why I was kind of initially drawn into the leadership at Tribe.
Got it. That's really exciting, because I can tell you honestly, like I Tribe is a big, like relatively big fund. You know, we're talking about what, 1.5 billion under management, assets under management.
Yes,
And
something like that.
yeah, so that's a sizable fund, yet it's still very low profile, like, you know, works only with like selected projects. And I love, if you actually go to the website of Tribe, you know, for someone who is listening to us, you know, you can actually go to tribecap.co and our values. I love the way that it was put, like, you know, Tribe Capital original story begin with the mission to reinvent venture capital from the bottom up, to be the best capital allocators and consistently deliver on our promise to our clients and founders. I mean, so it's basically a tribe, a real tribe of data scientists, of VCs, of successful entrepreneurs who did exits, right, from unicorns, and people who actually know how to build and not only allocate, right? Yet there's not a lot of information. Some of the projects that I know of, like, you invested in, but they're not even on your website, right? So tell us a little bit more about the secrecy, like behind the thesis. What's your investment thesis? Open up something for us.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's a secret, right? I think it's mainly the firm believes that if, you know, the team at Tribe can provide value as much as possible, that speaks volumes more than any other form of marketing. And I think at the end of the day, especially during these bear markets, people don't really care as much unless it's a big part of your business, right? If you're like needing to get influencers and needing to get faces to spread that message, it definitely hits and fits within that distribution curve. But I think at Tribe, they just think all about product market fit. They think all about how do they recognize, how do they improve upon, how do they create better metrics to gauge and provide insight into current vertical that said project is trying to participate in. What's the differentiation associated? Is there engineering talent on the team that exists that we can lend to that team, and then thus becoming an incubation partner and or building alongside that company? That's definitely not me, by the way. But I think overall, that's kind of been the ethos, right? There's been many, internally, we have tons of communication. I think outwardly so, we're quite selective. And that really comes from, I think, both Jonathan Su and Arjun Sethi, who are just focused on like just doing the work. Whatever that is, just do the work. And I think there's this belief and ethos within Tribe to evangelize a culture that is really driven by performance and metrics that people can measure. And so I think the write-ups and the marketing, while they're there sporadically, I think of them more as like research or analytical or kind of outward bound in a way to say, hey, this is how we're thinking about this space. Here's how and why we decided to participate in this experiment. Here's our learnings associated. And so, you know, internally, we have these kind of circular newsletters to our LPs and to our partners, and also internally to our coworkers and team, where we talk about these things in an open field. So I'll give you an example, right? And a lot of people don't know this, but every Monday, we have a 7.5 hour plus long conference call with the team.
That's impressive.
There's like breaks, right? But like there's like breaks for lunch and like breaks for like, you know, water, coffee, tea.
For breathing.
But, yeah, for breathing. And the idea was like, not everyone is in the office, right? Not everyone is there, but we need to create kind of an open forum and a consistent dialogue to go through every arm of Tribe as a firm. And at first glance, I was like, this seems like a really inefficient use of time. However, upon like several iterations of having these meetings, what we found was that there was this like overall understanding that everyone in the firm needed to have some basic level of knowledge around each vertical of the firm's work, whether it was ops, whether it was legal, whether it was back office, whether it was LP connection and interfacing, whether it was the network team, whether it was the building team, whether it was our liquid book, which we don't talk about, whether it was our, all these things we kind of run in tandem. And I just, stuff like that is different, right? So like as a venture shop, which like theoretically the system is designed quite transactionally, right? Like venture in general, to me at least, optically is a very transactional relationship, right? Meet company A, identify if you want to invest in that company and founder and team. If yes, then you invest, while also convincing that founder and team that you are not transactional and you're there for the long term. It's just like weird, like balance of like, well, what are you, right? You have this like fiduciary responsibility to, LPs and investors. And I think that's a struggle that all venture teams and shops have, is that there's this kind of bifurcation of like human connection and emotion. And also like, well, by design, we can't hold the tokens for very long, or by design, like as soon as we get them, we want to liquidate or find secondaries, whatever that is. And so the next iteration of venture, and hopefully Tribe will be a part of that conversation. And I'm sure many people who live in this sphere who are very powerful, crypto Twitter followers and influencers, they act as big as the largest VCs. They have as much weight and clout as much as the bigger VC names. Because they are connected, they have those relationships, they provide real value add, they are users of the product, right? They can iterate, they can code, they can speak to volumes with a smart contract, all these things that we need when we're building these types of protocols, et cetera. They have that experience. And so I think there's going to be a really unique blend of like, call it venture, if we're in venture 2.0, maybe it's venture 2.5, right? As it also needs to iterate and move along and also provide more value back to those participants. So yeah, it's awesome time to be in this space. It's a fascinating time to see everything occur over the past 6 and 7 months, especially.
Yeah, 100%. And then there's another interesting, I would say, point I want to discuss with you. So I'm sure you follow like the news, what happens right now, like generally overall in the world economy, which is global recession. There's a lot of the wars are happening. There's a lot of turmoil generally, right? At the same time, the VC firm, like probably less than 5,000 VC firms, accumulated $500 billion of dry powder. They need to deploy. So now what's happening right now, we see crazy projects that are coming out like with like unicorn valuation out of the blue, and there's no pre-revenue, there is no justification. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, like recent news about Adam Newman, Flow, and then a few other names. Now in crypto, we're no strangers to that, right? You see some projects that are lower their valuation, right? And they're struggling close to bankruptcy, and others that are coming out with like $1.62 billion valuation, no revenue, and out of the blue. I'm curious, like, what is your stance on this? Like, what is a, success formula that you're looking at, like, which is super important? And how do you do diligence projects?
Well, there's a lot of questions there. Maybe I'll go to kind of how we diligence projects. I think it depends on the vertical in the space, right? So if there's data to acquire and read and kind of, assimilate, we try to get access to the raw data room. This is the typical Tribe model, right? So if we decide to go deep down the rabbit hole with the company, the team then takes a look at the raw data room, ingests all of that raw data, plugs it into our internal machine and system, and basically runs these reports that spit out all these different metrics that hopefully give us insights into product market fit, right? Customer retention, churn, all the metrics that we think are important when running some sort of a business. We benchmark that against what we can find on other competitors, or even see if there's a behavior sentiment that is perhaps behaving in a similar fashion to another vertical. And so we try to gauge all these things to provide us with as much information as possible. And sometimes these reports are like 40 to 50 pages long. We then walk the company through what we think we have found. And either it's a red light or a green light or a yellow light. And then if it's a green light, we kind of explain why and how we see this. It's kind of confirmation or affirmation to the firm because they probably know that already. If it's a red light, we kind of walk them through again and say like, well, here's the reason why maybe we're being a bit resistant or we want to wait until there's more data available. And then we give that report to the founders to use at their own disposal. It's their data, it's their information. There's been firms and shops and companies and projects that have decided to go raise subsequent rounds based on that report because they felt like perhaps they knew their business a little bit better with more confidence, and we're able to kind of fill those gaps that were missing before. So that's the diligence side, and then there's obviously a human component there where you're underwriting risk associated with first-time founder, second-time founder, idea, differentiation, novel concept, right? Technical feasibility studies, kind of those concepts. And then typically someone on the team has invested or been a part of some vertical or has experience. Maybe it's something in like military tech DoD. Maybe it's something in vertical farming. Maybe it's something on like venture, investment, Carta-like related activity. Maybe it's something like Slack or a new Twitter or a Kraken or an FTX, whatever that might be. There'll be something there where someone has experience or a deep relationship that we can bounce those ideas and test those theories. That happens to be that's usually step 2, actually. And if it's very early stage, the team at large, and again, the partners at Tribe, are brilliant at this, is creating their own thesis around particular verticals, right? Like, okay, rent-seeking behavior used to exist in the second iterations of the internet. Is that going to continue in the next 5 to 10 years? Or will they be like actual kind of net spender activity? What does that look like? What types of companies and projects should be focused and allocating on that? Is this going to be a step-in or a Axie-like effect? Is there a long, bell curve associated with the rise and fall of interest and activity? I think all these things are interesting. I think at its core, a lot of these are still very much experimental. And so we take the approach where we're not afraid to kind of go at bat and experiment and also gauge and see the sentiment around some of these human behaviors around why consumers and participants are wanting to touch or be a part of these things, right? Mm-hmm. We're entering, like you said, into an interesting time, right? You've got these kind of market flurries and rallies that to some maybe are unexplainable, to others it kind of maybe gives them a checkbox of confirmation that they are still in the right space. I definitely don't know. I think when you just zoom out far enough, if this is something that you love to participate in, and if you love communicating and building and investing in these types of people and projects, then it doesn't really matter, right? Just try to stick to that goal and that thesis of this is going to be something that's going to be transformational, and I want to continue to spread those bets across the space or build and solve some of these challenges that people are facing. And there's many, right? There's many, many issues that we've seen, and a lot of that fallout is because of what happened in the past 24 months.
No, so which brings us to the next question, right? So if you were to identify 3 major niches that you would focus, that you use a firm that use a lot of data analytics, right? And you look like not just across different projects, but you look like, what's beyond that level, right? Looking at the different parameters, 10, 20 years of history. And what would you identify as the 3 major niches within the crypto space that you would be very excited and you see the huge potential that you're focusing right now?
Well, I completely, on a personal level, missed the entire NFT boom of 19, 20, and 21. I was really confused by a lot of the activity. I think what we're seeing now is, every Web2 marketer who has used social as a means of growing, building, and then selling products, goods, and services to that community is probably looking in or leaning into why a tokenized version or token gated community could be interesting to what they're building or what they've already built. Maybe it's a more efficient way. Maybe it's to create more loyalty. Maybe there's a rewards-based system, right? I'm unsure all of those different means of utility that can be created. I think that there's going to be a continual kind of trend towards real-world assets coming on-chain. I think DeFi will continue to evolve. I think compliance is a really important part of being kind of a real conduit to get institutions to really trust and want to participate. I'm very curious how kind of large banks play a role in all of this, if they do at all, right? And there's always a thesis of saying like, well, the big banks are actually going to be these third-party custodians to hold these assets. And then it feels a little bit like that would be going back to square one, right? Just replacing different terms, but you're still basically in the same system, and it's kind of rent-seeking behavior. I just firmly believe like whatever iteration that we interact with, and by the way, like the MetaMasks of the world are just incredible, right? Just the ability to kind of connect and interact with the different sites and projects. But I just have a hard time believing that like you're going to have to write down every single one of these things in the future, in terms of your seed phrase. And it just feels like whoever, whether it's a Miston Labs or whoever can figure that out, I think it's a really interesting time where, the UI UX is still so clunky and challenging for so many people. And that's why I think it's been such a tremendous opportunity for the early adopters to come in this space, because people just don't want to mess with that, right? And I think we fail, especially in the niche communities that we build, whether you're in venture, whether you're playing in crypto, whether you're in sports, whether you're in health and wellness. Like if you live in that bubble, the language is very easy for you to adopt because everyone speaks the same language. But then you fail to realize that like 90% of the world doesn't speak that language, doesn't even know that language even really exists, or the language seems too hard for them to adopt. So there has to be a bridge, and there has to be a good reason for the bridge, right? You can't just build a bridge to make it easier to gamble, right? There's got to be a real reason to bridge these things and a real value add. I think that what we're seeing from a societal perspective of that normalization from these very successful and wealthy crypto companies effectively buying their way into the social sphere, teams, owners, and branding of stadiums, right? Sponsorship, like these things are big social and cultural shifts and movements where you see the same thing. Like if I'm in Los Angeles and I drive by an arena and I see the name of that company every single day, it becomes normalized after a year or two. Yeah. After 5 years, I can't think of anything else except for that arena. Now, here in LA, people say like the Staples Center, that's probably going to be used for at least, I don't know how long, but it's just been that name for so long. But at some point, that behavior will shift. And so I think the association of challenge is going to be big. I think wallets are going to be a big, important aspect of how we think about this. But again, I think about like compliance a lot of the time because I just know that even the conversations that I've had 3-4 years ago with friends who run really large kind of legacy-based wealth management companies, they want to enter this space. They were very resistant many years ago. And just now are they starting to entertain the idea of being a custodial services provider to their clients who want to interact with digital assets. And so I think it's becoming much more mainstream than we realize, obviously with the BlackRocks of the world and all these large institutions that are spinning out arms. Anytime the finance is driven by opportunity, and if they can seek enough opportunity that's compliant, they will touch the space. If they can't seek it and it's not compliant, they don't have the mandate, right? I think that's a lot of times people have been screaming at the top of the hill, like, the herd is coming, the herd is coming. And that might be true, but I think that there's still a lot of things that have to be understood. And, regulation is something that I think is it's tricky, right? Because you want to foster innovation. Me being American, I want this country to really rise and kind of be its best self, while also being the kind of compliant and trusted place to know that if there is, a set of standard of rules to play within, people can operate within those rules. But then by nature, right, decentralized ownership and decentralized identity and decentralized finance is a bit antithetical to those things. And so I think that there has to be some kind of happy middle ground where you get you get a lot of the aspects of what we're trying to accomplish, but it gives, call it the rule makers or lawmakers of this country, some sort of insight into being able to have some kind of compliance measures in case something goes wrong. And unfortunately, that communication is really disconnected, or at least it seems to be really disconnected, right? You have theoretically and some of these conversations are actually really interesting, but I think some of these people are really, really old, right? I'm not saying that in a bad way, but it's just tough, right? Like, how do you communicate? Like, some of this stuff is really hard to understand. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to explain to someone who's 30 years old.
Listen,
like, imagine that person 70.
Some of them still don't get the web too. Like, you remember the hearing of Mark Zuckerberg when in all seriousness, the senator asks him, like, how do you make money? And he said, Senator, we do ads. And he's confused, like genuinely confused. He doesn't understand this simple business model of Facebook right now. It's Meta. And now we're asking them, oh, by the way, you need to understand much deeper level, which is Web3 wallet. We need to open MetaMask, Trust, or whatever. I mean, obviously, people just don't go there. It's a generational gap, right? So you're right. I mean, there's a lot of educational, I would say, gap between what's happening right now. But I want to also segue, if you don't mind, a little bit like into this NFT concept you mentioned. Listen, I will ask you a more personal question. Listen, you're a successful person, right? You have all the potential to launch your own NFT, right? And I'm sure you had multiple offers. I'm not even asking you that, and maybe you thought about it, right? Now, the question is, right, does it make sense? Because we have a lot of people who are coming on, like, really successful artists, whether they're like painting or architecture, DJs, like, you name it, right? And they're all telling, okay, how can we monetize our presence? We have a successful social media, as you mentioned, Web2, whatever it's Facebook, Instagram, following, YouTube. Now, how can we create an NFT community, right, and upsell and sell a few $1 million worth of NFTs? Now, it's challenging to say them, I can explain them that, it has to have a utility, it has to make sense, right? How do you deal with this? Like, and have you ever really considered to launch your own NFT?
I mean, I can tell you, like, 3 years ago, we were trying to figure out how to basically just create a one-to-one digital replica of the medals that I had won, but not for sale, just to preserve them forever on the blockchain.
Collectible,
right? Yeah, and still have never done that. I think, look, in full transparency, I just find it less interesting for me, right? And maybe I'm old, right? And that's fine. I don't know. It's not as interesting to me now. I do buy, like, digital art, but I don't resell it. I just buy it because I think it looks really cool. I'm like, oh, that's like, this is my brain. That's cool. It's not too expensive. I want that because I want to put it on a screen in my house and I want to look at it. It's like, to me, it's like an aquarium, right? Like, that's basically how I think about it. And yes, I have been approached many times by awesome friends who run some really amazing platforms that we all know of to get involved in the space. And I think, like, a part of me is like, one, I think there's a lot of risk, right? And I'm not willing to take that risk.
And we're talking about legal and compliance predominantly, right?
I think legal compliance, but also, like, I don't have control over this, like, token that, like, fluctuates wildly in price, that I'm not really sure the reason why it needs to exist. So, like, my ethos, and everyone makes their own decision. My ethos is, for me, like, I'm in my own reinvention. I'm transitioning from, like, Apollo 1.0 into hopefully Apollo 2.0 or maybe 2.5, right? And so if 1.0 was like, yeah, I'll try that. I'm not afraid of risk. Like, I'll go to bat and swing and I'll give my damn hardest try. And if it doesn't work, at least I can try my hardest, right? I've learned that sometimes that's not the best route. Now, as I hopefully will kind of transition and transform, I want to focus on things that kind of light me up and that make me really excited. And that means probably saying no to a lot of those other things that are perhaps a little bit shiny in the moment, whether it was the SPAC craze or NFTs. And I have participated in all kinds of things in the past. And I think that for me, if it's not a hell yes, it's probably a hell no. And so if it's floating in the middle, I tend to just pass on that and just rededicate my focus back into the things that I can't control. So that's not to dissuade or, like, dispel anyone from entering into the space. I would just say, to those who are trying to build something, is like, what's the reason behind this? Like, what's the goal here? If it's purely to make money, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, totally get it. And it's cool. Just know that it's probably pretty tough, I think, to have a long-term sustainable impact and creating a real utility there. I don't know. At least I've kind of struggled to find that, right? And there's nothing wrong with these projects, right? That are just trying to make money, as long as there's like intentionality and I think transparency around the efforts behind those projects. Again, as with every iteration of technology, I think like most of these things just don't need to be here.
Exactly.
And that's not to say, I mean, look, a lot of businesses don't need to be here either, right? I mean, 90% of all businesses fail, like in traditional businesses. So like a lot of restaurants don't really need to exist, and they go out of business, right? A lot of podcasts, right? They don't really need to exist. And a lot of podcasters, I think I saw the data when I was in a meeting earlier this morning, 60% or something of all podcasters quit before 10 episodes because it's tough, right? You don't get traction. It's not interesting. You don't want to continue. And by literally showing up for your 11th episode, right, you are like now in the 40th, percentile group that you weren't before, but just by like being there. And I think that there's something to be said about that in this space too. So I think if you're focused on building something that is really transformational, I do believe deeply in community, and always fascinated to see like how this phenomena of like the Bored Ape community and the CryptoPunk community, and there's been many others, have just garnered this like tribalism, and it's so strong to see these guys building stuff and then building off that brand and seeing what is possible. And so look, I don't know if I think many people probably say these are success stories in themselves, and I think I don't know what that next version of that is, but whatever the next step of those companies are, or like companies, will be so influential. They will be all over the web, right? And not just in the form of the holders of those tokens or whatever. So
let me ask you really briefly, like, and just to close this topic, right? You have a lot of athletes, friends, right, who probably also like they won gold medal or silver or any other, like, those are the epic moments when you actually prepare for many years, and this is your kind of the moment of your life. Some people don't get the second chance. I mean, you were lucky to win multiple medals, but also statistically, not a lot of athletes even get there. Like a lot of them fail, and it's hard and it's terrible. They get depression. They end up in a very bad place. Now, for those who actually achieve, like those are probably the most important moments in their life. So maybe it makes sense in a way to kind of convert it into NFT, and not to create like a hype and like sell it for millions of dollars, but again, for collectible reason, as you mentioned, right? So what would be your top 3 advices, the tips for your fellow colleagues in the field to do that?
Oh, that's tough. I would say focus on, for the NFT space, I'm by far not the expert. I would say first and foremost, think about ways to provide real, engaging, actionable insights and engagements within your community. And I think if you focus on the right things for the right reasons, right? Like if you're like focused on building a game developed by non-game developers who have no experience in games or understanding what that looks like, or understanding what the in-game ecosystem looks like, let's just like look at the statistics there of like what you're actually missing. So it's great to have those dreams. That's the important part. And then you have to mechanically break that down in terms of what's next. At its ethos, like I think the question remains, like, why are you building this, and why does this need to exist? That's it, right? If you can answer that like openly and radically transparently with yourself, maybe you won't succeed, but at least I think you morally and ethically will be able to align yourself with things and say, okay, I know why I'm getting up in the morning. Okay, I know why I'm getting so excited about this. And I can tell you, like, if it's for the wrong reasons, and only you know that, right? Not you, but like only the founders and the engineers of these projects know that. Like your passion will fizzle, and if you go and raise capital, you may or may not be able to stick through the most challenging or dark of times. Everybody is here during a bull market. That's the easy part. But the last mile is always like the least crowded, right? So with every project, seeing it through is really tough. And there's a reason why what comes up from the rubble of every bear market, whether it's in real estate, whether it's in traditional, stocks and equities, or it's in the digital asset space, whatever that might be, the last mile, even the Olympic space, right? Like everyone wanted to go and win and be on the podium. But unfortunately, most people just were not willing to go through what it takes all the way consistently to the end. And that's what we look for in founders, right? Sometimes the idea is not even that great, but there's something about that founding team that is so inspirational. Maybe they have a chip on their shoulder. Maybe there's like some childhood traumatic event that they're trying to overcome, and they're expressing that through building a company to seek validation and affirmation. Doesn't matter to me. Like I recognize those things. Most Olympic athletes in the world and professional athletes have like some kind of like fractured, like psychological, circumstance and instance that happened that they've carried with them for the rest of their career. And it makes them fired up and hungry and edgy. And entrepreneurs and builders are no different. And maybe that's something they're saying like, hey, like I'm driven by changing the world in a positive perspective. And I don't know, like, that's the form of like whatever the next iteration of a DAO is going to look like, right? Like, are we going to see that happen? So that's my like, I guess my advice is like really kind of have more inner dialogue with yourself. And I think you'll get a lot of the answers that you seek, and then do the work researching and understanding what's happening in this space, see what the success stories were. We know the Kevin Roses of the world, but people fail to recognize that Kevin has been around for a long time. He put in the work. He has put in his own time, money, energy, resources. And if you asked Kevin probably what he used to do back then, years ago, on like a Saturday, he was like probably reading or interacting with people. So people are doing things because they genuinely enjoy it and they love it. If you can check that box, I think you're really getting momentum. And then the second part is like, identify what's the purpose, right? Like why do you want to build this thing? Is it going to change lives? Is it going to improve lives? Are you building something fun? Is it engaging? Why will you be able to win? And having that open conversation.
That's totally like understandable, like, and I'm a very practical guide, and I know that you created a lot of beautiful practical guides through your inspirational stories, especially in your book, like hard to pivot, like so hard pivot. Sorry, that's and where you actually identify.
And it is hard to pivot.
Yes, 5 golden rules. Yeah. I'm just curious if you were like really briefly, if you were to summarize how young entrepreneurs who like, maybe just college dropouts, like building their first decentralized application or something exciting that they're really passionate about, how can they apply those golden principles, like the 5 that you identify: the gratitude, the giving, the grit, gearing up and go? Like, how can they get the courage of enough stamina to actually go there, and not only to build the product, but actually to pitch to investors, not to be afraid, and to make sure that they finalize it and it makes sense? Maybe a few practical advices on fundraising.
Yeah, look, number one, like age is such an important factor here, right? If you're young and you're building something, I would seek out some form of mentorship in the form of a VC, in the form of other community members, people who have perhaps done it before, and shadow them for a period of time, learn from what they have learned and the mistakes that they have made, and apply them to your life. I think fear can be paralyzing, but it also can be an incredible motivating tool. So I had performed from a fear of failure. So just recognizing your own levers of insecurity, perhaps self-doubt, whatever these mechanisms are that are either holding you back, or they can be amazing, powerful levers to lean on. And maybe that's a chip on your shoulder. Maybe something happened and makes you angry, and that's what gets you up early in the morning and makes you stay up late at night. Whatever those things might be, identify them and then learn how to use them as a tool. Don't become the tool where those emotions use you. That's the first part. I think the second part would be, instead of always, I would say like always embrace change, right? Like change is really hard. Human behavioral change is even harder. And I think that people have this association that they want the change, the sexy idea of like creating a January's 1st, like New Year's resolution. But by February, like 80% of the people have dropped off. They just can't maintain that level of consistency and focus. And so creating habitual routines that allow you to perform your best consistently are important. And then also just understanding that, the empathy that you lead in your team. And I know when you're young and you're like, like breaking stuff and you're going super fast, like those may seem like secondary priorities, but the relationships that you build today, and how you treat people on an ongoing basis are so powerful, and they go beyond any modes of business. And this is my own experience, right? I'm 40. So like, this is a different realm. If you're 20 years old, my first Olympic Games was 20 years ago, right? So You're entering into the space where treat people as if that person is going to start a company in 5 years or 10 years. And they will base their interaction on their first one. Typically, when you meet someone, like the 5 to 10 minutes you meet someone, they've already judged you in their mind. That's how people are pre-wired. So just remember that, right? Like lead with the right types of intentionality, whether it's people on your team, whether it's demanding the best from your internal, coworkers, or you're meeting an investor or a potential investor. Let them know who you are as a person, right? Let them know why you have the skill sets and traits to figure this thing out. For me as an investor, I look to the human kind of basic behavioral tendencies as a means of, do I think this team is doing it for the right reasons? Do I think this team has what it takes to pivot, reinvent, adapt to any climate, right? If there's a 90% drawdown, do they stick with it, try as hard as they can? Are they open to criticism? Are they coachable? Whatever those things are, I think those are really great traits to have. And then the last thing I would say is, just because your natural strengths are X, Y, and Z, you don't need to spend a ton of time. I would say focus on strength design versus weakness design, right? So this is where being a team builder or a team leader in all these projects, delegation of roles, goals, and responsibilities, when those are outlined very clearly with crystal clear clarity, I think it just makes for a much more seamless process. So the roles, goals, responsibilities is a really important part of building your team. And then where your weaknesses are, instead of, yes, you should always be trying to improve them in areas where you can, but you may get a 5 to 7% bump overall. Your strengths are what make you you. So don't lose 20% of your strength to improve 5% of your weakness. The balance isn't worth it. So use that metric as, I know what I'm really great at, and I brought on this partner, this person, because they're great at the areas where I'm just terrible. I naturally don't gravitate towards them. So try to build that as much balance as possible. That's at least how I think about it.
Love your vision and love how holistically you view that. So probably, again, we can talk for hours and I really enjoy learning from you, but I want to ask you more on the last question, which is personal, and I never notify people about what I'm going to ask so that it will feel more genuine answer they will provide me. So what's your personal meaning in life?
So what I would call my ikigai, I don't know if you're familiar with ikigai.
Yes.
This Venn diagram of these circles, right? Where you've got what the world needs, what the world will pay you to do, your strengths, your passions, vocation. And in the middle is what you would clarify as your purpose. The middle circle is the purpose. And you want them to overlap as much as possible. For me, I receive deep amounts of fulfillment when I can help people. I can help them live better, higher quality lives where they are less suffering. And doesn't mean they're in total bliss and equanimity, but I would say if I can help people just minimize the suffering that occurs psychologically, that's what I feel like my gift is. And that's what I feel like my purpose is here on this earth. And so everything now that I'm trying to touch and be a part of is kind of revolving around this. How are these neuroscience tools, human behavior tools, psychological tools, longevity tools, health and fitness and wellness, communication tools, technology tools, how do we encapsulate them in a way where these are providing us with amazing bumps in performance and feeling better and happiness that otherwise I wouldn't get? And so, look, that's my purpose, right? Is I want to help communities and people at large live higher, better quality lives for themselves and identify what that path is for themselves. Not say my path is the way to follow, but finding your own inner voice and your own inner dialogue. And that's hard, right? Because we are surrounded by distractions of social and crypto, FOMO. It's tough.
It is listen, it's a beautiful purpose, right? And there's no way to just express my gratitude. And I'm sure a lot of people who will either view this on YouTube or listen to this as in a form of a podcast will appreciate your wisdom, right? As you mentioned, you're here to share, and we know each other from I think consensus 2017 or 18, somewhere and I've seen you in multiple occasions that you're very open-minded. Some people when they they get this fame, or they get some kind of like situation like where they're like comfortable and they're already well off, and they become less approachable, so to speak, right? And then their ego grows. Like, you're the opposite of the description. You're always the same, always welcoming, always open-minded and like friendly. So I think that speaks a lot about your inner work, right? And then so with this said, like beyond your expertise, of a person who's now a professional investor, like, I really appreciate you on this level, right? So, and I know that a lot of people will just listen to maybe some of your motivational speeches, which are also available on YouTube. There's a lot of them, and I urge people to see how, because I know Apollo also dedicates a lot of his life to charity, which I really also appreciate. I mean, he would never speak about this himself, so I have to advertise him in a way, right? So that's a practical showcase, like that a person really cares, and helps others, like not just by talking about it, by practically like committing not only money, time, and efforts, right? So I appreciate your wisdom again, Apollo, and I hope that we'll maybe do another episode together.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for having me on.